Hello, Buckeye fans, and welcome to another episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. This is the first episode of this show since Ohio State lost its first game to Oregon last weekend. We're going to get into that significantly here, and I know that there's been a lot of talk this week about this game, so I wanted to approach it from a different angle than I think others have or some others have. While it may be, you may be a Buckeye fan that wants to be angry and hear other people be angry. That's not going to be this show. We are going to try and be fairly critical, but also rational on it. And there are plenty of other shows out there I know that you can listen to if you want angry Buckeye fan or angry Buckeye media member to just say so-and-so should be fired or so-and-so should – this, that, or the other thing. I'm going to try and take a different approach and kind of look at things in a different way. And again, if that's not what you're looking for, I completely get it. I am a fan of sports teams myself and get very frustrated at times. So I understand the need to vent and to hear other people vent too. But we're going to look at it from a different perspective, a couple different perspectives actually today. And before we get into it, I have pumpkin Imperial Pale Ale. I'm going to have to drink this slowly because it's 8.6% and I still have the rest of my day to go. But I thought I'd get in the spirit of October and Halloween and, bring us up to, the pale ale season, the pumpkin season, if you will. So I wanted to start this show this week by diving into the Buckeyes from, as I said, a different perspective. I wanted to get an outsider's view. I know sometimes as Buckeye fans, as Buckeye media members, we really dive in on everything. We're looking at the fine-tooth comb. And so as I've done before, I like to ask people to come on who maybe have a more 300-foot view of the Buckeyes that cover things from a different perspective. And so today we've got 24/7 Sports national college football writer Chris Hummer joining us. Chris, how are we doing on this fine Thursday?
Not as good as you with an 8.6 ABV beer, man. So
yeah. Well, I didn't realize it was this strong when I bought it, and then I was pulling it out, and I was like, I wonder what this is because I hadn't opened them yet. And we'll see what happens.
It's going to be a sleepy late afternoon for you.
Yeah, I've got most of my work done. We got one more thing I have to finish, but some baseball a little bit later, some NFL games tonight. So maybe I won't make it through all that, but we'll see how it goes. Cheers.
I got water.
That's all right. Smart. Let's get into it. As I said, I think you have a different perspective than most people who listen to the show, myself even, who covers the team. Obviously, you are aware, of what happened last week with the Buckeyes in Eugene. First, let's start. What did you make of that game? What were kind of your initial takeaways after you finished watching it?
I thought it was two of the four best teams in the country playing a really good football game in October. Honestly, I'm sure Ohio State fans are livid, and I get it. There's more that goes into the Ryan Day and Ohio State conversation, given everything that's happened the last couple of years, but in terms of Ohio State, I left the game feeling the same way I felt coming in, that they're one of the 2 or 3 or 4 best football teams in the country. And a result like that in Eugene isn't going to change the way I feel about Ohio State, especially, frankly, in a 12-team playoff era. And I know this is not a 12-team playoff discussion, but this is different than previous years where if you suffer that devastating loss to Michigan, your season's basically over and you don't get to go to the playoff. Ohio State has a lot of chances in front of it to still make a statement. Ohio State could still win the Big Ten. And again, I'm sure Ohio State fans don't want to hear this, but I'm very bullish on this team moving forward, even though I do have a couple concerns coming out of the game.
As you looked at it, was there anything that surprised you about the Buckeyes in terms of what you thought coming in and then what you thought after watching them play against Oregon?
Well, there were 2 areas with Ohio State that jumped out at me. The first was not a surprise because I had questions about this offensive line all offseason and how it would come together. And obviously the Josh Simmons injury does not help that view. I have significant concerns about that unit moving forward, at least against elite competition. What did surprise me, however, was the way the secondary played, particularly Denzel Burke. I thought Ohio State had a really elite defense overall and a really, really good secondary. And to see Burke burned the way he was frequently on Saturday night, I think is pretty concerning. I don't think that's necessarily going to be reflective of the way that secondary plays all year. There's too much talent in that group for that to happen. But yeah, that definitely raised my eyebrow a little bit. I thought the secondary was going to be an advantage for Ohio State all year.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting as well. I'm going to talk more about that later, but I think the speed of Oregon caught Ohio State a little bit off guard in that secondary, just in terms of what they were going to do. I know Oregon hadn't. I was talking to some of our Oregon guys at the game, and they hadn't thrown deep a ton.
Not at all.
Yeah,
very little.
And Evan Stewart, I know, hadn't really done much other than the Boise State game where he kind of went off. So, you still would like to see a team prepared for some of that downfield shots and whatnot, but it did seem to catch Ohio State off guard. From an Oregon perspective, I know we're on an Ohio State podcast, but I think that's relevant to this conversation of what Ohio State faced. What did you see from them that maybe was new to you, or was that kind of what you expected from Oregon in general?
You just mentioned it. I saw a very different Dillon Gabriel. I don't know the stat off the top of my head, but I believe they only had a couple passes of 20 plus yards all season going into the game. And they had 4 or 5 on Saturday. Dillon Gabriel is somebody I think throughout his career has been very boom or bust in terms of stretching the field. And on Saturday, he looked like one of the best deep ball passers in the country. So that was my biggest takeaway there. Also, I think Oregon has done a really nice job beefing up their defensive line via the portal. Jordan Burch was out. I think that was a huge storyline going into the game. But when you add Derek Harmon in the portal, from Michigan State, a player I know Ohio State was interested in during the offseason, obviously, it makes a huge difference. Derek Harmon was commanding a significant amount of money, close to 7 figures in the spring. And Oregon went ahead and went all in there, and it really paid off. And it's not just Derek Harmon along that defensive front for Oregon. They are very deep there. And I think that is an example of really some of Oregon's NIL work at play, obviously, but also just the focus that Dan Lanning's had in putting together the roster. You win because of your defensive line strength on defense. Ohio State also has an elite defensive line. I think that's why they've had a lot of success early this year, but we really got to see that matter on Saturday. I think you could argue Derek Harmon was the best player on the field Saturday for long stretches. And I think he really made the difference in the game and really made it difficult for Ohio State to establish a consistent run game despite all the talent in that backfield.
Yeah. If you have questions for Chris while he's on here, feel free to throw those in the chat if you are watching this live. Sue asked, and I'll be interested to see what you think on this because, again, I think you have a different perspective. Shouldn't we have adjusted better, faster once Oregon proved they could and would take those deep shots? I'll let you give your perspective first, and then I will give mine.
I won't pretend to have turned on the all 22 after this game and really broke it down. Nor am I really qualified to do that. I certainly have an opinion, and I talk to a lot of people across the country about these things, but I would just say it's really difficult for a coaching staff to adjust. It's really hard, I think, in my opinion, in any walk of life, to adjust quickly to something that you hadn't prepared for or hadn't seen. And for Oregon, it just wasn't part of their game plan all year. And for them to push the ball the way they did, I think it's certainly a surprising element. Obviously, Ohio State should have adjusted. I have not seen how they played defense. I don't know if they were playing cover 1, cover 2, while they were doing all games. So I can't really speak on that. But yeah, in the second half, you'd like Ohio State to adjust a little better to that. But that's also tough to do because I think Jordan James averaged 6 yards a carry on Saturday. So you can't provide support in the box and also play off on the receivers and protect from the deep pass. It's kind of a one or the other thing. And unfortunately for Ohio State, they were getting bludgeoned on both sides of that. So if you're going to criticize the staff for anything, it's not taking away one of those two things.
And I will say, I wanted to make sure I had this right. The last deep shot, at least in terms of throwing deep, there were some other big plays, but in terms of Denzel Burke specifically giving up the big plays. That Tez Johnson touchdown that he gave up was with where is it? I just had it. 1:24 left in the first half. So second half, I think if you look at the big plays, they did limit, especially through the air. There were only a few in the second half. So I think there is an argument that Ohio State did make some adjustments.
It was really just that Dylan Gabriel scramble in the second half.
Yeah, right. Right. And, we can break down a lot of specific.
By the way, that's another thing Dylan Gabriel hasn't done this year. He hasn't run. Like, that's something that made him really effective early in his career. Like, that had been non-existent in his game. And he had that 27-yard touchdown run at the biggest time in the game. And that's just something he hadn't shown on tape all season.
Right. And I think if you look at that, people were frustrated with JT Tuimoloau, selling all the way out to stop Jordan James. But as you put it, if you haven't seen it, you've got to stop that running back who's averaging over 5 yards a carry. I think it was just a good play by Dylan Gabriel. And sometimes you have to tip your hat. Maybe Ohio State tackles better, then maybe he doesn't get into the end zone, but it was a good play, as you mentioned. You talked about going forward and, the opportunity for Ohio State to still win the Big Ten championship game. Where do you kind of put the Buckeyes now? I know they're fourth in the AP poll. In your eyes, kind of where is your ranking as you watch across the country and how you feel like they fit into the national narrative now?
I picked Ohio State to win the national championship coming into the year, and that pick hasn't changed coming out of Saturday, to be honest. I know, I get it. I get it from Ohio State fans' perspective. You want to win these games, but Ohio State lost by 1 on the road to one of the 4 best teams in the country. Had another second been left on the clock. Ohio State, that's another debate, obviously, and another conversation with how that ended. But Ohio State probably wins that game. I'm not backing off from my preseason prediction. I would still pick Ohio State to win the national championship. I wouldn't be shocked if these two teams meet again in Indianapolis and Ohio State wins that game in that setting. So no, I still view Ohio State as one of the 3 to 5 teams in the country that has a legitimate shot to win a national championship. I think shifting from that position based on one result would be short-sighted.
It is weird, right? Because we're so used to I won't say old era, but the recent era of college football where one loss can derail a season. Obviously, there's been national champions with one loss in the college football playoff era, but how much does it change your mind just in general, not specifically Ohio State, but about the 12-team playoff and how you view teams now, be it Alabama, Georgia, whoever, because they can take a loss or two?
I've always been of the mind that it devalues the regular season. Like, obviously, Oregon against Ohio State is still an awesome game on Saturday. I don't think anybody's taking it away in the moment, but I just think like that loss on Saturday doesn't matter as much as it used to, because Ohio State still has games against 4 of the top 7 teams in the Big Ten left on its schedule. There are plenty of opportunities for them to pick up wins. If Ohio State goes 10-2 in the regular season, I find it hard to believe they would be left out of the playoffs. So even if Ohio State loses 1 more going through, they're probably going to make the playoffs and they're going to have every chance to win a national championship. So it absolutely changes the way you think about it. I'm covering Texas, Georgia on Saturday here in Austin. And if Georgia loses that game, they'll have 2 losses, but I don't even think they're out of the playoff race with that. So it's just it's a different thing. These games still matter, obviously, and they're still big environments. Alabama and Georgia a couple weeks ago was still awesome. But Alabama can lose to Vanderbilt and easily make the playoffs still. It just kind of tells you, and no offense to Vanderbilt, no offense to our guy Barton Simmons over there. Vanderbilt is an excellent team this year. I think they're a legitimate top 25 team and should be ranked. But it just changes the way you think about these results, because the effects aren't as drastic when you talk about somebody's playoff hopes.
I made a comment to a friend of mine who was very despondent, even on Monday, who is a Cleveland Browns fan. Look, if the Cleveland Browns lose a game, the season isn't over. And they were like, don't compare the Cleveland Browns and the Ohio State Buckeyes. And I was like, okay, well, that's not what I meant. I just meant if your NFL team loses a game, it's not over. And I know it's different, but we are shifting in that direction. You mentioned the game this weekend. You obviously are very familiar with Texas being in Austin. how do you view like Texas versus these other teams below them now? Maybe Texas and Oregon with these undefeated teams, these one-loss teams. What has been the difference, and kind of where do you see Texas standing out, or is it as a matter of they have to prove it Saturday against a team like Georgia?
I think I mean, you could say both. I think Texas has been very elite this season in almost every area. It's hard to find a fault or a weakness. Part of that is the competition. Like Texas has, I think, the nation's #1 scoring defense, but they also haven't played an offense that ranks in the top 80 in terms of yards per play. And if you look at the quarterbacks they've played this season, it's a pretty rough crew of opposing passers. So I think we'll know a lot more about Texas on Saturday, but at the same time, I think it's team speed across the board for Texas that really impresses you. Texas, their top 5 receivers are all sub 10.8 guys in the 100, like elite track speed. Some guys like Isaiah Bond are sub 10.5.
Yeah.
Texas's linebackers are as good as there are in the country in terms of going side to side. Elite athletes. The linebacker play on Saturday between Texas and Georgia is going to be outrageous. It's like outrageous in terms of the overall team speed there. Texas secondary is much improved. You really can't find a fault. I thought DT would be a weakness for Texas this year, but Vernon Broughton has played like one of the best DTs in the country so far this season, and Texas finally has some edge rushing that it's lacked in the past. So it's really tough to find a hole with Texas right now, but that's with the caveat that they haven't really been tested, even an iota defensively this season, just because of the schedule. And I know brands like Michigan and Oklahoma scream test, but it's been anything but on the defensive side of the ball for Texas so far.
Yeah, I watched the Michigan game, and those were two teams playing almost a different sport, just the way they approached that game. For me, I'll be interested to hear from you what you think when you actually are there on Saturday, but just watching games in this new era, this new conferences, like Saturday's game for me being in Autzen felt like a non-conference game. Like it didn't feel Big Ten yet. Have you found yourself still, thinking of Texas and Oklahoma as Big 12 teams, or have you started to adjust more to some of these teams shifting conferences?
I mean, I keep thinking, when is Texas going to go to Manhattan to play Kansas State, or when is Ohio State going to town? So yeah, it's very odd. And I live here in Austin, so I mean, the only SEC team that's come through so far is Mississippi State. So it's not like it's been an elite parade of talent coming through here. And yeah, I still think it's very weird. Obviously, the ratings are good. Like, at least if you're a fan of the SEC and the Big Ten, or if you're ESPN or Fox, like it's been, or CBS, obviously. Shout out to CBS on Big Ten, or the Big Ten on CBS. The ratings have been very good because of these changed matchups. But yeah, it feels odd. It feels very odd all around. Like, I don't know. It'll take me a little while to get used to it.
Yeah. And it's different than, at least for me, when the Big Ten added Nebraska and Maryland and Rutgers. Like, those weren't programs coming in contending right away. And within the SEC and the Big Ten, you've got at least one program who is showing that they are going to compete this season. Sue asked, curious how you could look at Texas and still think Ohio State wins the Natty. How do you justify those statements there, Chris?
I think Ohio State's as talented as any team in the country. I mean, I really have a hard time finding much fault with Ohio State even after Saturday's game. Like, I don't think the secondary is going to play that bad again.
Right.
The offensive line is a concern, obviously. Like, you want that offensive line to play a little better than it has, especially on Saturday. But like, Ohio State has got draft picks all over the place. Like, it's just a really talented roster. And I know people like to hate on Ryan Day, and I understand his record in big game situations, but I still go back to 2 years ago. If Marvin Harrison doesn't get hurt, or if a field goal goes a slightly different way, like, he probably has a national championship on his ring on his finger. And I know it's not how college football works, but it's a long season. And I know Texas has looked really good so far, but you have to look at the teams they've played. Like, I know Michigan and Oklahoma are huge brands, but Michigan was starting a walk-on quarterback against Texas in Ann Arbor. It was Wink Martindale's second game with Michigan. And I think the defensive communication was a little wanting at times there. And then against Oklahoma, like, Oklahoma was missing its top 5 receivers, as one of the worst offensive lines in college football, and was starting a true freshman quarterback. That's not really a it's not really a good measuring stick for Texas. Sue, like maybe I'll come back on next week after this game and we can talk about a different story. If Texas blows Georgia out, like I don't think if Texas blows Georgia out, like Texas is in a different conversation with everybody in the sport. But I don't think that's going to be the case on Saturday. I think it's going to be a very close game. I think Texas is a little better, but I don't think the gap between Texas and Ohio State is big, if there is one at all.
And let me send you out on this just while we've got you. You talked about Texas. We've talked about Oregon, Alabama, and Georgia. Just what you've seen from them, watching them from a national perspective and kind of where they fit into the grand scheme of things here.
I would have Alabama and Georgia behind Texas and Ohio State at this point. Alabama, like obviously, I just don't think Alabama is as good up front as we were used to on both sides of the ball. Vanderbilt really won the line of scrimmage in that game, and South Carolina's defensive line particularly gave Alabama fits on Saturday. And you could really say the same thing about Georgia. Injuries have played a role there. Obviously, they're missing an All-American right guard.
Yeah.
The defensive line has been banged up all season long for Georgia, but they're just like not winning up front the way you'd expect them to. I think their defense has really regressed to the mean. Like it was a historic unit in 2021. I think they're like 70th nationally in yards allowed per carry. And let me like make sure that's correct. But like they're 45th. I'm sorry. Like not
Still
70th, but it's way below what you would expect out of a program like Georgia with the front seven pieces they have. And like, I think both programs are very good. And I think at least one of them is going to make the playoff because they're more talented than most teams on their schedule. But I think for this year, for 2024, like I think Ohio State, Texas, and Oregon, I suppose, after Saturday are like on a different tier, at least for now. And again, with the caveat, this is college football and teams get better as the season goes along.
All right, Chris, thank you very much for joining us. I'm glad you gave a different perspective because I think, like I said, I think sometimes we get so close to things, even, trying to cover it from a neutral perspective, like breaking down every little thing, you can lose perspective on the big picture. And so I like to talk to some of you guys and I like to catch up with you. So I appreciate
that, man. God's plan, man. God's plan. Hope everybody has a ABV count that's pretty high in Columbus this weekend during the bye.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. Off weekend. Have fun at the game this weekend. That should be a good one. I will certainly be tuning in, and I'll be interested to see what you put out afterwards.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ben.
All right. Thanks, Chris. All right. Thanks again to Chris Hummer. Does great work for 24/7 Sports, CBS Sports in terms of the national perspective. Jahar O'Happiness said, I like how you dodge my question. Also, Patrick, not dodging any questions. Questions usually come at the end. I was just getting some questions specifically for Chris out of the way before before he had to go. So if you have questions, though, I know I've seen the ones that are in the chat already. If you'd like to put more in there, I will certainly answer some at the end. This will be the Ryan Day portion of the podcast. And I want to make one thing clear before I start. I am in no way a Ryan Day defender. I think that there are legitimate questions about Ryan Day. And look, the record in big games, and by big games, I mean top 5 games, is what it is. You can't run from that. If you're Ryan Day, you've gone 2-7 against teams that when you played them were ranked in the top 5. And I think that's fair to ask questions because you are Ohio State and you expect to win every game. And Ryan Day knows that. He said that. But I think we can have a conversation about Ryan Day and this Buckeye team and have some legitimate talk back and forth about it. Because if there is the argument that, okay, Ryan Day struggles in big games, I think you have to look at everyone else, right? So I'm not asking who you would rather have or who would replace Ryan Day if Ohio State were to fire him. But I think if you look across the sport in college football right now, there's not many people that you could say you would take over Ryan Day. If you were to swap those coaches, I'm not sure that there are as many people. And obviously, again, I understand frustrations coming off a loss. Emotions are high. I'm not trying to take away from that. I get it. I would also say that it's easy to say, fire this guy, fire that guy, bench this player, whatever it may be, especially in the heat of the moment. And that's why you guys are fans and I'm in the media, and those coaches are paid to make decisions that hopefully, win the game, but also don't reflect that knee-jerk moment or knee-jerk reaction in the moment. So Ryan Day, I want to read to you the losses that he's had, because all 7 losses are against top teams. So he lost 29-23 to Clemson in 2019 in the college football playoff. That was Ryan Day's first loss as Ohio State's head coach. 2020, the bad loss, obviously, to Alabama. You lose in the national championship game. That was obvious. Well, first you beat Clemson, then you lose in the national championship game. I would say that you take any team in the country that year and put them up against Alabama, they're probably losing the game. And then you take some key guys off of that team because there was COVID issues for Ohio State. The score is probably the same. That was one of the best teams in college football, hands down. 2021, Michigan loss. 2022, Michigan loss. I'm not going to make you relive those. Those are bad losses. Those are Ryan Day's seat slowly getting warmer. No doubt about that. You can't lose to Michigan like that. That's not what you do at Ohio State, especially when you're coming in after Jim Tressel and Urban Meyer. 2023, Michigan again, and then the Missouri game, which I almost think you should throw out, but you can't do that. And I say that because the way that Ohio State approached that game, Kyle McCord was gone. Devin Brown gets hurt. The offensive line shakeup. Frankly, I still don't believe most of those players wanted to be there, despite what they said, just because it wasn't where they thought they would be in terms of playing in a non-college football playoff game. So I also think, and I'm going to give context before I get into my big point here, I also think you have to look at some of these wins because, yes, he's only won twice against top 5 teams. One of those was that Clemson win I mentioned earlier. The other one was the Notre Dame win. People like to brush the Notre Dame win off, which I don't think is fair. That was, yes, Notre Dame went on to not be as good as they were at the beginning of the season. It was the first game of the season. Ohio State wins 21-10 at home. But still a good win. Still a very good win for Ohio State at the time. You can't argue one thing and then argue it the other way. Some of those wins, they come at the end of, a lot of those come at the end of, or those losses, come at the end of the season. So yeah, you've got a fully formed team. Notre Dame, based on talent evaluation, was as good as any team in the country. Did they live up to it? No, but that was what they were at the time. We can only base it off that if we're using these rankings. And I think that's another thing that I wanted to bring up is people like to say, Ryan Day's got wins against top 25, Michigan State, Wisconsin, Penn State, Indiana in 2020, Northwestern, Penn State again, Michigan State, Utah, all these teams. And I think a lot of people, because they're not top 5 games, and I'm not sure where the cutoff became top 5. Until last season, it was top 4 that made the college football playoff. So I'm not really sure why top 5 became the cutoff there. But these ranked games are all part of Ryan Day's resume, and they are part of this team's history here. And so, just to say, well, it was number 13 Wisconsin in 2019 when Ohio State won 38-7, or it was only number 14 Northwestern in the Big Ten championship game 22-10 in 2020. Like, I get that maybe those teams don't have the cachet of other teams, the teams that Ohio State has lost to. But there was a reason they were ranked that high, right? If we're using rankings as our justification, what was it a few years ago? Michigan State came in top 10 and Ohio State won 56-7. You look at some of the guys that came off that Michigan State team. I mean, that was a talented team. Now, again, I'm getting that I understand that, it's not these huge marquee games. But I think that Ryan Day's lost some of those because they are big games. Now, the Michigan game, I will repeat, I think that is, if you lose one of those, maybe two, maybe you lose 2020 or 2021, excuse me, and then last year, but you win the home game in between, fine. I think you can deal with that. Sometimes you're going to lose in that rivalry. In fact, that's the way I think that rivalry should be. But to lose 3 in a row, it's not acceptable. Ryan Day knows that. This game this year, regardless of rankings, will be hugely important. So obviously, 2 blowouts losses to Michigan are very bad black marks on Ryan Day's resume. But I think we do have to consider some of these other games and going to Penn State last year and winning on the road in that environment. Yeah, it wasn't a great game. The defense had to play great, but it could be similar to Oregon. What if Oregon loses 2 more games the rest of this season? You still were beat by the number 3 team in the country. I don't think that'll happen. But my point is, winning at Notre Dame last year was a big deal. And that's why you saw a fired up Ryan Day afterwards. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm completely defending Ryan Day, but you look at some of the other top coaches or big name coaches across college football. And if I get to one that you would rather have outside of the obvious that you can't have, please let me know if you're listening to this, watching this live. Look, Kirby Smart is not leaving Georgia for Ohio State. It's not happening. But Josh Pate for 24/7 Sports and CBS Sports made a really good point about Kirby Smart this week. And in comparison with Ryan Day, like, they're not that dissimilar. Kirby Smart has won 2 national championships, but it took Kirby Smart a while to get things going. It was in his 6th year that Kirby Smart finally won a national championship game or a national championship after going 14-1. He had a loss that season, similar to Ohio State now. So Kirby Smart went 8-5, 13-2, 11-3, 12-2, 8-2. And as Josh pointed out on his show, and if you haven't heard that, I recommend going back and listening at least to the part about Ohio State. His reputation was can't win the big game. Now, a lot of those came against Alabama and Nick Saban's Alabama, and I get that. It's a different thing. But that was the reputation until Kirby Smart did it and won a national title. Ryan Day will have to deal with the same thing because he has to win that big game. And beating Oregon, I think if he'd beaten Oregon this year and Ohio State didn't win, say he beats Oregon, Ohio State wins the Big Ten championship game, they go to the playoff and they lose quarterfinal, semifinal, whatever. I think this narrative would still be, Ryan Day's 3-6 against top 5 teams. Like, this would still be thrown in his face because I don't think you lose that reputation until you win the big game, which is the national championship game. Remember, Ryan Day's been there before. He still has this kind of moniker hung on him. So Kirby Smart's not coming, but Kirby Smart had a similar situation to Ryan Day before 2021. And then they win back-to-back. And now no one talks about that anymore, though I know there is frustration right now with things down in Georgia, but no one's saying fire Kirby Smart at the moment. Let's talk about some other of the top coaches in college football. Lincoln Riley. Do you want Lincoln Riley over Ryan Day right now? His team is 3-3. And the last 2 years, despite having a Heisman Trophy quarterback, he was not able to get to the college football playoff. A lot of people, when Lincoln Riley went to USC, and he's 22-11 overall at USC, not a great mark. When he went to USC, a lot of people were talking about him and Ryan Day, kind of similar young coaches. Lincoln Riley got to start Oklahoma, obviously, where he did well, 55-10, but couldn't win when it mattered the most. At USC, haven't been able to get over the hump. He talked about this at media days. Maybe they are still searching for talent, but 3-3, I don't think is what anyone out in LA that's a Trojan fan expected. So would you rather have that? Would you rather have James Franklin, Kalen DeBoer? Would you rather have Dan Campbell, not Dan Campbell, Dan Lanning? I keep doing that. Would you rather have, a guy who is still pretty young, only in his 3rd season? He's 28-5 overall, hasn't been to the playoff. Yeah, he just beat your Buckeyes. I don't know. I think that's probably one that's probably too soon for Ohio State fans to really be interested in. I think you'd look across my point here, and I'm probably forgetting some guys. And there you go, Sue. That's one I meant to mention. The only coach I would consider is Sark, Smart, and Lanning, and none of them are coming. Even Steve Sarkeesian, yes, he's got things going now, but first of all, there's a track record of losing in big games for him as well. He is 31-14 in 4 years at Texas. Ryan Day's lost 7 games. He's 31-14. Now, you did have to build that Texas program back up. I'll give you that. But he went 12-6 at USC. Now, obviously, there were some things going on, and 34-29 at Washington. If Steve Sark can go on and win the national championship this year with Texas, I guess that would put him ahead of Ryan Day in kind of the pecking order. But I think it's a similar coach. You got a lot of talent. You made the playoff last year, didn't advance to the national championship game. I think there are a lot of similarities between a lot of these guys right now. And that is kind of my point is the Ohio State fans who have criticized Ryan Day, and I see it a lot. I think it's fair to criticize, but I also think you have to look at college football as a whole and really look at these other coaches and say, you're kind of in the same boat with a guy like Ryan Day. He's a very good coach. He's not perfect. I think if you went and had a sit down with Texas fans at some point, maybe not right now, everything's really good there, but say they lose to Georgia this weekend at home. If you were to talk to Texas fans next week, I think they'd be saying similar things about Sark. If you were to talk to Trojan fans, even the fans down in Athens at Georgia right now, LSU thought they were getting a great coach in Brian Kelly. Just the list goes on and on. I don't think there is a perfect coach out there. Now, if Ohio State were to move on from Ryan Day, is there maybe a young and up and coming coach or somebody that maybe hasn't had the opportunity at a big time school? I don't know. I didn't look that far into it, but the point is a lot of these coaches are in a similar boat, and what changes the perception. And again, I go back to a guy like Kirby Smart. What changes the perception is you finally win the national championship, but that isn't easy to do. And the college football playoff, in theory, expanding to 12 teams has made it easier because there's more teams in it, but you still have to win more games. And so if Ohio State is whoever wins this year, it's not going to be an easy thing. It doesn't matter the talent that you have on your roster. Obviously that helps, that gets you to a certain point, right? But there are things like going on the road to Eugene. You face other really talented teams, and this is going to continue in the Big Ten. I think the days of undefeated teams meeting in the national championship are probably numbered. I think you'll see 1 and 2 loss teams regularly playing for the national title, not only because the college football playoff is expanded, so it'll include more of those teams, but also because the conference, the Big Ten, the SEC are more difficult than they've ever been. When Urban Meyer was running through the Big Ten year after year, and not even every year, who was your toughest opponent? Michigan State some years. And again, I give credit to Michigan State earlier. And look, I think that is what it is. But that Oregon team, we just saw them play a Michigan State team, not a good Michigan State team. But even that Oregon team, I think if you were to compare them to Michigan State in 2015 that comes in and knocks off Ohio State and goes to the college football playoff, it's not the same level. They didn't have the same overall talent. So maybe I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth with that argument. But my point is the Big Ten is going to be harder and harder to win. Penn State looks really good. I assume unless there are some serious sanctions, Michigan will find its footing again. USC someday maybe will be good again consistently. So I think it's unfair to just immediately throw Day under the bus without looking at, well, this is kind of going on at every program across the country. All of these top programs, the coach isn't perfect. Not everyone is Nick Saban, who found the secret sauce to college football and had a dynasty because of it. It's similar to the NFL, where you look at teams and coaches and you compare them to the Patriots and Bill Belichick, but they were just different. There was the perfect recipe for success. So that's kind of my thoughts on Ryan Day. Again, not perfect. I think end of game situations have not been good, though I think Saturday's was a bit overblown in terms of his game management. Cheers. I think that he's still, and I'm interested. We didn't get to talk to Ryan Day this week or any of the coaches. I think whether Chip Kelly is calling the plays, but they still went very Ryan Day-esque in the second half, running the ball 6 times or 12 times, 6 in each quarter. For me, that's not enough when you have the 2 of the best running backs in the country. Like there are certainly things I think you can criticize Ryan Day for, but I think it's premature to say fire Ryan Day because of one game again this season. I'm talking this season when you lose by 1 point on the road, and there's not somebody else out there that you're like, well, that guy has it figured out. Now, I've seen people in the comments mentioning Jim Knowles. That's another conversation. If we want to have that, we can. Ohio State's defense was not ready to go in this game. Chris talked about it a little bit. I think, were you preparing for solely what you saw on tape and not necessarily what you could see? If you're Jim Knowles in this defense, I think there might be some realism to that, because the coverage on some of those plays is certainly questionable. Now, I will say everyone wanted press coverage a couple weeks ago, and you got press coverage. It wasn't press coverage on either of the Denzel Burke plays, I don't believe, but Jordan Hancock late in the game, press coverage, pass interference penalty, if I remember correctly. Same with Davis and Igbinosun at one point in the game. So I think you can see why they've not done that as much as fans would like. I think the defensive line certainly had some issues in terms of getting to Dylan Gabriel. I will get to that because I did see a question about that or comment. But yeah, I think the entire defensive game plan and what you're going to do going forward should certainly be questioned. I think you have to clean a lot up. I will say I don't think Denzel Burke plays as poorly as he did in that game again. I think Denzel Burke is a very good player. I think that it was a bad game, a really bad game at a really bad time to have such a bad game. I don't think Denzel Burke's perfect, though. I have criticized some things for Denzel Burke before. Obviously, his sophomore season was not good. Now he's talked about some of the reasons why, but there are times where, especially against teams that aren't as good, and this has happened earlier this year, where Denzel Burke gives up a catch or is a step out of position or whatnot, and it didn't cost him, and he's able to make a play. So I think there is some fair criticism for Denzel Burke, but this was above and beyond. This was, if he gets beat one time, fine, you live with that. That's not good, but you live with it. He got beat twice deep. He gave up, what was a really good catch, to be fair, for Evan Stewart for the touchdown. But still, if you want to be one of the best corners in the country, you get in the red zone, you need to be a lockdown defender there, and it didn't happen. So I think there's fair criticism there. I pointed out in something I wrote earlier this week, I'm really curious about Ohio State's zone defense. It's something I've noticed the last few weeks that I'm going to pay more attention to, but it does seem to be that teams have found holes in Ohio State's zone in the middle of the field where they're making very easy catches. The whole idea of zone defense is, there's going to be places where there's going to be holes in the zone, for lack of a better term. But they're supposed to be in places where it's more difficult to make that throw or to get that catch. And throwing wide open over the middle is not where you want the hole in the zone. And it's happened a few times now. Michigan State exploited it. Iowa had a couple, and then Oregon did it at least 3 times that I can remember. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to put on this defense right now that we came into the week saying was the best or one of the best defenses in the country. I still believe that this is a very good defense. I think that they were outdone. And I've said this a few times before. I've said it a lot this week. These matchup games, as Ohio State likes to call them, in 2024 don't often come down to defenses. This is not the era of defense wins championships. It's defense can the defense get enough stops to win the game? You look back at some of Ohio State's biggest games. You look back at the biggest games across the country the last few years, handful of years, they're typically pretty high scoring. Think about Alabama, Georgia earlier this season. And I don't think either of those two teams are particularly good defensively, but that was a shootout, right? I'm not covering either of those teams, but I don't know what the conversation was afterwards about either of their defenses. I can't imagine it was very good. I think, obviously last year Michigan had a very good defense, but the Ohio State-Michigan game was 30-24 or something like that, 31-20. I forget exactly what it was. 30-24. Yeah, I have it jotted down there. So those are two good defenses. That's not a low scoring, grinded out type of game. Those are just rare when you have two talented teams. And Michigan's offense last year, good, not great, but still able to make some plays, obviously. So I think that we don't, you need this defense to not give up those big plays. And I'm not just talking about Denzel Burke. That's the championship level defense you need. Would it be great if you could hold teams to 10 points in matchup games or, under 200 yards in match games? Yeah, but that just doesn't happen. It's not the way of the world. College football, NFL, everything is geared towards the offense, and the advantages are towards the offense. And so, yes, Jim Knowles' defense needs to be better. Criticize Jim Knowles. I think people have left, at least as far as I've seen, Tim Walton out of this conversation, Matt Guerrieri out of this conversation, despite the fact that it was the secondary where they were really burned. Now, again, Jordan James had a really good day, and the fact that he's running untouched on many of his runs for 4 or 5 yards is problematic. He ends the game with 115 yards on 23 carries. So it's all across the board defensively. The blame needs to be laid, and you hope for Ohio State's sake that the Buckeyes go out there and get some of this figured out, because you're going to be tested again. This Penn State offense, I know in the first half they didn't look great against USC, at least in terms of the scoring, but watching that game, they do some creative things, and I've watched Penn State a little bit. They do some creative things. You're going to have to be ready for some stuff. The offensive coordinator from Kansas is going to dial some things up. This Indiana offense in a few weeks, even Nebraska with Dylan Raiola coming in, you don't think that kid's going to want to show something in the shoe after being committed to Ohio State? So this defense certainly has a lot to prove going forward. And I think the offense does too. I haven't seen much criticism of Will Howard, and I think that's fine. He had a really good day in terms of the numbers, 28 of 35 for 326 yards and 2 touchdowns. But, a few big mistakes. And the one that I have pointed to the most is 3rd and I think it was 3 when he fumbles the snap. Ohio State is driving. You with a chance to go up 2 scores. The momentum is in your favor. You're probably confident you're going to pick up that 3rd down, and you bobble the snap, lose 10 yards, have to punt. And that, to me, not that the game is won or lost on one play, but that's when the game turns. Because if you pick up that and you move down the field, even if you kick a field goal on that drive, I feel like Ohio State was in control then. You'd forced a 3 and out coming out of halftime. You go down the field and score a touchdown to go up. What was it? You go up 28-22, and then You have that happen, or you get the stop on downs. Yeah, that was the goal line stand by Ohio State. And then you have a chance to go down, score, make it at least a 2-score game. And that for me was when it felt like, oh boy. And it was. Yeah. So let's get to some of these questions. I've seen a decent amount of them in there. I marked a few of them here. All right, Jaro Happiness, since you called me out earlier for avoiding it, who's going to ask Ryan Day about the turmoil within, I assume, our coaching rooms, Larry Johnson versus Jim Knowles? I've seen a lot of this past week, probably before then. Here's what I will say. I'm not going to pretend to know what's going on between Jim Knowles and Larry Johnson. So, if you're looking for me to give you insight on that, I don't know. What I do know is what I see with my eyes, and that is that Jim Knowles, cheers, isn't playing the same way he would have played at Oklahoma State. There is no Jack linebacker, or Jack player, I guess I should say. And they're playing with Larry Johnson's 4 down front. Is that the problem? I don't know. It's tough to say. I don't know what a Jack would do in this defense because we just haven't seen it really. I think that it was a really good thing in Jim Knowles' defense at Oklahoma State and at Duke because you didn't have the 5-star edge rushers that you have here. Now, are the 5-star edge rushers getting their job done? Well, and I think this related to another comment. Let me see if I can find it here. Good radio here. Well, there was a comment about no pass rush. Oh, yeah. No pass rush, and our defense forces no punts in the fourth quarter. Well, the pass rush was there. They pressured Dillon Gabriel on 40%, almost 40% of dropbacks. So they were getting pressure. Now, pressure and actually affecting the quarterback are two very different things. Watching the game back, I think JT Tuimoloau was actually pretty good. I know the play that everyone's going to think of is when he tackles Jordan James, who doesn't have the ball, and Dillon Gabriel runs for a touchdown. Again, as we talked about with Chris, that's not something Dillon Gabriel had done. And earlier that game, it wasn't exactly the same play, but very similar. JT gets his 1 tackle for a loss because he sells out and takes down Jordan James in the backfield. So, yes, there was pressure, but we've talked about that with this team before, going back to last year. Pressure versus actually getting home is a different thing. Dillon Gabriel, I thought, did a really good job of stepping up in the pocket, moving around. This is coming off of Ohio State actually playing pretty well on the defensive line the week before against Iowa. And I thought Cade McNamara actually did a pretty good job of maneuvering in the pocket and whatnot. So, yes, the fact that they weren't able to get home and sack Dillon Gabriel even once is problematic. But I do think that it's not good enough, certainly. But going back to the question about turmoil, I don't know. I do think that it's clear that Larry Johnson and Jim Knowles have different philosophies. Is that working? The two have been together now 3 years, but I don't want to speculate on that without having knowledge of it myself. I've heard some things too. I know people have put stuff out there, but it's not coming from anyone that I know for sure. So, I think there's probably some difference of agreements between the two, but that doesn't mean you can't figure out a way to make it work and can't make it better than it has been right now, because certainly right now it's not enough. In these big games specifically, going back to our conversation, Lisa Sims, I don't count Notre Dame because we almost lost. Only reason we won is because Freeman is an idiot and had 12 players on the field. He actually had 10 players on the field, which certainly helps. No doubt about that. Hard to say if Ohio State wins or loses if they do put the full allotment of guys out there. Point is, you played the game, you won the game. I don't think you can turn that around flip it on them. Rick S. said, I hope Day and Knowles can turn this around. Yeah. And one thing I didn't say with Knowles that I meant to say earlier, I am a little bit surprised that we didn't see more pressure and some different things. I thought there would be a more aggressive version of Jim Knowles, and they did bring some simulated pressure, including the one play where they dropped all 4 defensive linemen, which I'm not sure what was happening there. It didn't work because you had 4 defensive linemen covering one guy and no pressure on Dylan Gabriel with the linebackers blitzing. So, I do think if you're going to question something, I think you can start to question Jim Knowles in these games. And I do wonder if 2021 kind of scarred him a little bit and like not wanting to do that stuff. And maybe this goes back to defensive line. I don't know. I don't want to say things that I don't know anything about. Rick S., I expect my dissatisfaction with Knowles before the season began. I argued for Jim Leonard. Michigan went to an NFL DC and McDonald, and ultimately might be what Day has to do. Maybe. I think the issue with coaching or hiring a coach that is an NFL coach is you have to find somebody that can recruit, which, I guess if it's somebody who went to the NFL or was in college, has college experience, then that's fine. But it doesn't always work as well as a guy like Tim Walton coming back. And then they want to be able to do it. You mentioned Jim Leonard. He's with the Denver Broncos right now. Is he going to want to leave the Broncos, who actually are playing some really good defense, to come back and coach Ohio State? I don't know. But, it would be it's certainly worth a conversation down the road, but Jim Knowles isn't going anywhere the rest of the season. So I don't think it's worth really discussing right now. Let's see if we have anything else there. Jaro Happiness said, all those guys, this is from our coaching conversation, have lost big games. I think Ryan Day gets the short end of the stick because of all of Urban's success and the team up north and Day not being able to match it. Yeah, certainly. I think we should remember Urban lost to Virginia Tech, did go on to win a national championship. Urban kind of messed around way too long with a really, really talented team in 2015. Urban lost to Iowa and Purdue. Urban lost in the Big Ten championship game to Michigan State. So, again, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but he did win a national championship, and he'd won 2 before then. So he gets the benefit of the doubt. Jar also points out Day is also young in head coaching years. As fans, we have to go through the growing pains with him. I do think that's a very valid point. Ryan Day's only been a head coach as long as he's been the head coach at Ohio State. Most coaches don't start their head coaching career at a place like Ohio State. So that's a very valid point there. Kevin says, I'm just now seeing the NCAA close the loophole on what Dan Lane did with 12 men on the field. Yes. If you're Ohio State, you have to – Ryan Day was talking on his radio show today, and I thought he handled it really well when asked about that happening. I mean, I would be livid if I were Ohio State. Like, credit to Dan Lanning and his staff for doing that and recognizing that they could get away with that. But if you're Ohio State, you have to just be livid. Kyle Penrod said, I was okay with the game. I thought the offense played pretty well. A couple fluke things in this game. It happens. Bama isn't far behind OSU in talent, and they lost to Vandy. It's perspective on this game. Oregon played very well, and they even left some points on the field. I agree. Also, we haven't talked about that atmosphere, which, let me tell you, if you weren't there, it was nuts. Ohio State, I felt like, didn't handle that to the best of their ability early on. But yeah, it was about as good of a 60,000 seat stadium I've ever seen, 55, whatever it was. And yeah, it was crazy, especially at the end of the game. Robert Nussgart says, if you want to see Ryan Day's value, fire him and see how fast he gets into the job. Jim Knowles is a different issue. Definitely not Buddy Ryan. Yeah, I think, again, good point there on Ryan Day. Like, look, Ohio State has gone from Jim Tressel to Urban Meyer to Ryan Day. There has been no drop-off, unless you want to talk about the Michigan game, the results against Michigan. But in terms of just overall consistency, No program has been able to do what Ohio State's done. Now, Nick Saban was at Alabama for a long time, so obviously he had a lot of success. But to go from coach to coach to coach, and obviously Luke Fickell is in there for a year, but the consistency that Ryan Day has had, or that Ohio State, has had at the coaching position in terms of being able to sustain success. If Ryan Day weren't a good coach, and I know people say like, oh, he had Urban's talent and he was able to build on that. Go look at Texas and what happened after Mac Brown left. Obviously, Sark has them rolling again, but how many years did you hear, is Texas back? And then they weren't. That can happen just as quickly at Ohio State as it did at Texas. USC, after Pete Carroll leaves, they're still not back. So, I think grass is always greener. Not a guarantee here. All right, let me see if we have anything else here before we finish this up. Rick S. said, don't think we have a free safety on this defense. Downs and Ransom are both in the box safeties. It came back to bite them against Oregon. I think Caleb Downs can play free safety, no problem. I think they don't necessarily use him that way all the time because of the scheme, but I don't think that, I guess you could make the argument that what came to bite them was the fact that they didn't have help over the top on those two Denzel Burke plays, certainly, but that's not a free safety problem. That's a play call problem. Leaving, you trust Denzel Burke and he didn't deliver once, and then you don't do it. You maybe don't do it again. Kevin Chavez, similar thing. I think if Burke gets safety help, that leaves other weapons to work with. So kind of like pick your poison, or Burke isn't fast enough. There isn't much you can do. Staff might have felt that. I think, I don't think Oregon's receivers were, it's not like Ohio State. They have two really good receivers. They had their multiple receivers out, and then they had one ejected. So I think you had two guys you had to worry about there. I think you can manage that if you're Ohio State. Yes, I think this is a really good point by Rick S. The fumbled snap was analogous to the Quinshon fumble, except we did get to punt. Yep, pretty much. To me, that was a huge play in the game. Jaro Happiness said, lack of rotation is crazy. Dudes are gassed by the fourth quarter. I don't know. Oregon didn't rotate much. They seem to be doing just fine. Sue asked, do these coaches ever have other coaches like ex-NFL, et cetera, to look at their film and give them ideas on how to fix things? Seems an outside perspective would be good. They've got plenty of guys on the staff now with the way things work, and you don't have to have a certain number. So there are NFL guys, there are non-NFL guys. They've got the guys to look at this and try and get things figured out. Just to be fair, Jason Skip Spielman Jr. said Jim Knowles is a fraud. Can't wait until he starts packing his bags and we get knocked out of the playoffs. I don't know if that's going to happen, but if it's another similar performance like these, I guess it could be possible. All right, seeing if there's any other questions here. All right, I think we've covered most of it. I hope that this show was informative. I think, when you come off a game like this or any of those games that Ohio State loses, I think there are different ways you can go about it. You can be angry, you can whatever, you can be upset. My approach is always to try and approach it to talk about it rationally, see how things get figured out, and that's what I tried to do on this show, and I hope Chris helped with that. So my dog is now barking. Hopefully that was informative to you. Hopefully that helped give some perspective. And we'll talk next week, Buckeye fans, as the Buckeyes get back on the field against Nebraska and try and get this bad taste out of their mouth. Cheers.